The highway at 3 in the morning is a lonely place, a desert of asphalt where the only company you have is the steady hum of your own engine and the occasional flash of a distant road sign. I had been driving for nearly 5 hours, my eyes heavy and my mind drifting into that dangerous, hypnotic state that long-haul drivers know all too well. The road ahead was a straight line cutting through the empty plains of the Midwest, with nothing but darkness on either side of my headlights. I was alone, or at least, I thought I was until I noticed the pair of lights in my rearview mirror that refused to change their distance. At first, I didn't think much of it because it is common for drivers to cluster together for safety on these long stretches of road. But after 20 miles of perfectly matched speed, a small seed of unease began to grow in the back of my mind. I was going 65, so I sped up to 75 to see if they would pass me. The lights stayed exactly where they were, a pair of cold, white eyes pinned to my bumper. I slowed down to 55, expecting them to finally get frustrated and overtake me on the empty passing lane. Instead, they slowed down too, maintaining that same haunting gap of 50 yards. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably just another tired traveler who was using my taillights as a guide to stay awake. But as we passed the next exit, which led to a small, darkened town, the car behind me didn't even flicker its blinker. I decided to test my theory. I took a sudden, unannounced exit onto a service road that led to a closed gas station. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched my mirror. The other car followed, its tires crunching on the gravel just seconds after mine. There was no reason for anyone to be out here, and there was certainly no reason to follow me into a dead-end lot at this hour. I didn't stop. I looped around the dark pumps and accelerated back onto the highway, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I needed to see who was behind me, but the glare of their high beams made it impossible to identify the make or model of the vehicle. It was just a silhouette, a large, boxy shape that looked like an old work truck. I pushed my car faster, reaching 80, then 90, but the truck kept pace with terrifying ease. It was as if we were connected by an invisible chain, one that was slowly being pulled tighter. A sense of isolation began to wash over me as I realized how far I was from the nearest open rest stop. The map on my phone showed nothing but empty space for the next 40 miles. I looked at the passenger seat, wishing I had someone there to talk to tell me that I was overreacting. But the silence of the car was deafening, broken only by the roar of the wind against the windows. Why was he doing this? Was he waiting for me to run out of gas? Or was he just playing with his food before the strike? The psychological pressure was starting to break me. I could feel his gaze through the glass, a predatory focus that made the hair on my neck stand up. I decided to try one more maneuver to lose him. Up ahead, I saw a construction zone where the highway narrowed down to a single lane between concrete barriers. If I could timing it perfectly, I might be able to create some distance. As the orange cones began to appear, I waited until the very last second to swerve into the narrow lane. The truck didn't flinch. It followed me into the concrete canyon, the walls reflecting the roar of its heavy engine. In the middle of the construction zone, the truck did something that made my blood run cold. It turned off its headlights. Suddenly, I was staring into a black void in my mirror. The vehicle was still there. I could hear the rumble of its exhaust and the whistling of the wind around its frame, but I couldn't see it. It was a ghost in the dark, a shadow that was stalking me at 80 miles per hour. The sheer malice of that move told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't a tired driver. This was a hunter who knew exactly how to terrify his prey. I felt a sob rise in my throat, but I forced it down. I couldn't afford to lose my focus now. I reached for my phone, but the screen remained blank, the signal lost in the vastness of the plains. I was truly on my own. I watched the odometer, counting down every mile like it was a heartbeat. 30 miles to the next town. 25. 20. The truck suddenly turned its lights back on, but this time they were on high beam, flooding my cabin with a blinding, white light that reflected off every mirror. I was driving blind, squinting against the glare, trying to stay between the lines. He was trying to run me off the road. I felt the back of my car shudder as the truck tapped my rear bumper. It was a gentle nudge, a terrifyingly controlled hit that sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. He was testing my stability, seeing how much it would take to make me spin out. "Not today," I whispered to the empty car, my voice trembling but determined. I saw a sign ahead for a way station, a place where truckers often pull over to rest. It wasn't a town, but it was a place where people might be. As I approached the turnoff, I didn't slow down. I kept my speed high until the very last moment. Then I slammed on the brakes and pulled a hard right into the way station lot. The truck tried to follow, but because of its weight and the speed we were traveling, it couldn't make the turn as sharply as my smaller car. I heard the screech of heavy tires and the hiss of air brakes as the driver struggled to maintain control. I didn't stop at the entrance. I drove straight toward a group of parked semi-trucks, their engines idling with a comforting, deep rumble. I pulled my car right between two massive trailers, cutting the engine and turning off all my lights. I sat there in the absolute darkness, my chest heaving, listening to the sound of my own pulse. A few seconds later, I heard the heavy rumble of the work truck entering the lot. It moved slowly, prowling past the rows of parked rigs. I stayed huddled low in my seat, peering through the gap between the trailers. The truck crawled past my hiding spot, its lights scanning the area like a searchlight. It was an old, rusted flatbed, the kind used for hauling heavy machinery. There were no plates on the front. The truck stopped just 20 feet away from me. The engine idled for what felt like hours, the vibration rattling my windows. I held my breath, afraid that even the sound of my lungs would give me away. Then, with a sudden rev of the engine, the truck accelerated and sped out of the way station, disappearing back onto the highway. I didn't move for a long time. I stayed between those two semi-trucks until the sun began to peek over the horizon, turning the sky a dusty purple. Only when the world felt bright and real again did I finally turn my key and finish the drive. I never found out who was in that truck, but every time I see a pair of lights in my mirror on a dark road, I feel that same cold shiver, reminding me that some people don't need a reason to hunt. They just need a target. The forest on either side of the mountain pass felt like it was leaning in toward the road, the thick branches of the hemlock trees forming a tunnel that swallowed my headlights. I was driving through a remote stretch of the Appalachian Highlands, a place where the radio signal dies 40 miles before you even reach the foothills. It was just after midnight, and the fog had begun to roll off the peaks, turning the world into a gray, soup-like blur that made every curve a gamble. I was tired, my eyes burning from the strain of watching for deer, but I was only an hour away from the main interstate. As I rounded a sharp, descending bend, my heart jumped into my throat. There, stretched across the entire width of the two-lane road, was a massive fallen oak tree. I slammed on my brakes, the anti-lock system pulsing under my foot as I skidded to a stop just feet away from the rough, jagged bark of the trunk. I sat there for a moment, the engine idling, my breath hitching as I realized I was trapped. To my left was a steep rock face that bled damp moss, and to my right was a sheer drop-off into a ravine that looked bottomless in the dark. I put the car in park and stared at the tree. Something felt wrong about it. The wood didn't look like it had rotted or snapped under its own weight. The edges of the branches looked clean, almost as if they had been cut with a chainsaw to make the fall more precise. I looked around, my pulse quickening. There were no other tire marks on the road, no signs of anyone else hitting this obstacle before me. The road was perfectly silent, except for the tink-tink-tink of my cooling engine and the distant sound of a rushing creek far below. I reached for my phone, but as I expected, the screen displayed the dreaded "no service" message. I felt a cold prickle of sweat break out across my forehead. I knew I had to turn around, but the road was so narrow that a three-point turn would be nearly impossible without sliding off the edge into the ravine. Just as I shifted the car into reverse, I saw a flicker of light in my side mirror. A small orange glow appeared about 50 yards back the way I had come. It was the cherry of a cigarette. Someone was standing in the middle of the road, right where I had been driving just 60 seconds ago. They weren't moving. They were just standing there, watching my car. My stomach did a slow, sickening flip. If they were there to help, why hadn't they shouted? Why were they lurking in the shadows of the trees instead of coming toward the light? Suddenly, a second light appeared on the other side of the road, near the fallen tree. A man stepped out from behind a large boulder, holding a heavy iron pry bar. He wasn't wearing a high-visibility vest or any kind of roadside assistance gear. He was wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt and heavy work boots. He didn't say a word. He just began to walk toward my passenger side door with a slow, deliberate pace that screamed predatory intent. I didn't wait to see if a third person would appear. I threw the car into reverse and floored it, but the back tires hit something solid with a violent jolt. I looked through the rear window and saw that a second, smaller log had been rolled out into the road behind me while I had been staring at the first one. They had boxed me in. I was stuck in a 50-foot trap on a mountain ledge, and the man with the pry bar was now only a few feet from my window. I locked the doors just as he reached for the handle. He yanked on it with such force that the entire car rocked on its suspension. He didn't look angry. His face was a mask of cold, professional indifference. He tapped the pry bar against the glass. A sharp, ringing sound that made my ears ring. "Get out of the car," he said. His voice low and gravelly, barely audible over the hum of my engine. I didn't answer. I looked at the log behind me and then at the ravine to my right. There was a small, narrow strip of dirt between the end of the log and the edge of the cliff. It was maybe 3 feet wide. If I could get my passenger side wheels onto that dirt, I might be able to squeeze past the barrier. But if I miscalculated by even an inch, the car would tip over the edge and tumble hundreds of feet into the darkness. The man at my window began to swing the pry bar, the metal whistling through the air. The first strike hit the safety glass, spider-webbing it into 1,000 tiny white fractures. I knew the second hit would shatter it completely. In a moment of pure, raw instinct, I shifted into drive and cut the steering wheel hard to the right. I ignored the man screaming at me and the sound of his metal bar slamming into the roof of my car. I drove toward the edge of the abyss, my front right tire sinking into the soft, wet mud of the shoulder. The car tilted dangerously to the right, and I could hear stones tumbling down the cliffside, bouncing off the trees below. I pushed the gas pedal down. The car groaned, the frame scraping against the side of the log as I forced the vehicle through the gap. I could see the man running alongside me, his face twisted in a snarl as he tried to grab the door frame, but the momentum was on my side. The back tires caught a patch of solid rock, and the car lurched forward, popping out of the trap like a cork from a bottle. I didn't look back. I kept my foot pinned to the floor, the car swaying wildly as I sped down the mountain road. I didn't stop until I saw the bright, neon lights of a 24-hour truck stop 10 miles down the road. I pulled up right to the front door, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't even turn off the ignition. When the police finally went up there 2 hours later, the logs were gone. There was no sign of the men, no pry bar, and no cigarette butts. The only evidence that anything had happened was the deep, jagged scratches along the side of my car and the shattered glass sitting in my passenger seat. I don't drive mountain passes at night anymore. I've learned that sometimes the road isn't closed because of an accident. It's closed because someone is waiting for you to stop. The digital clock on my dashboard flickered to 2:14 a.m. as I crested the final ridge of the high desert plateau. The road was a lonely stretch of Highway 50, a route so desolate it is often called the loneliest road in the country. My air conditioning was humming a low, steady drone to keep the dry heat at bay, and the only light for 50 miles was the concentrated beam of my own high beams slicing through the sagebrush. That was when I saw a figure standing on the shoulder, their thumb outstretched in the classic sign of a hitchhiker. Usually, I would never stop for a stranger in the middle of the night, but the person looked small, hunched over, and utterly exhausted. They were wearing a light summer dress that seemed far too thin for the plummeting desert temperatures. I felt a pang of guilt thinking about leaving a young woman out here where the coyotes and the cold were the only company. I slowed down, my tires crunching onto the gravel as I pulled over about 20 yards ahead of her. I watched her in the side mirror as she walked toward the car. She moved with a strange, stiff gait. Her head bowed so that her long, dark hair obscured her face. I rolled down the passenger window just a few inches, making sure the doors remained locked. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice sounding thin in the vast silence of the desert. "I just need a lift to the next town." "Please, it's so cold out here," she replied. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it sounded oddly flat, lacking the frantic energy you would expect from someone stranded in the wilderness. I hesitated for a second, a cold instinct in my gut telling me to just drive away. But she looked so frail, and the nearest town was 40 miles of empty pavement away. I hit the unlock button, and she slipped into the front seat before the locks had even finished clicking. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the scent of perfume or even the dust of the road. It was a heavy metallic smell, like old copper or a butcher shop. "Where exactly are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light as I merged back onto the highway. "Just forward. Just keep driving," she said, her eyes fixed straight ahead. As we drove, the silence in the car became suffocating. I tried to make small talk, asking her how she ended up out here, but she gave only one-word answers. I glanced over at her occasionally, but she never looked back at me. She just stared at the dashboard, her hands folded neatly in her lap. After 10 minutes, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. She was wearing heavy, mud-caked work boots under that delicate dress. The laces were tied tight, the kind of boots a construction worker or a hunter would wear. And then, as the light from a passing road sign swept through the cabin, I saw her hands. They were large, calloused, and covered in fine, dark hair. These were not the hands of the young woman I thought I had picked up. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as the realization set in. I wasn't sitting next to a stranded girl. I was sitting next to a man in a wig and a dress who had been waiting in the dark for a sympathetic driver to stop. My mind began to race, cataloging every exit and every possible weapon I had within reach. I had a heavy metal flashlight in the center console, but if I reached for it, he would know I was onto him. I looked at the speedometer. I was doing 70. If I jumped out, I would die. If I stayed, what would he do when we reached the next town? "You're very quiet," the passenger said suddenly. The voice was different now. It was lower, thicker, and dripping with a dark, mocking playfulness. "Just tired," I managed to say, my throat feeling like it was filled with broken glass. "It's a long drive. It's about to get a lot longer," he whispered. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw his hand move toward the pocket of the dress. He pulled out a folding knife, the blade clicking open with a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the small car. He didn't point it at me yet. He just held it, the moonlight catching the edge of the steel. "I want you to turn off at the next dirt road," he commanded, his voice now fully masculine and terrifyingly calm. "If you try to signal anyone, or if you slow down before I tell you to, I'll open your throat before you can touch the brake." The nearest dirt road was a mile ahead, a path that led deep into the salt flats where no one would ever find a body. I knew that if I turned onto that road, I was a dead man. I had to think of something, and I had to do it before we hit that turnoff. I saw the sign for the turnoff approaching. My heart was hammering so hard against my ribs I thought it might crack. I began to slow down, pretending to comply. "That's it. Nice and easy," he muttered, leaning closer to me, the smell of copper now overwhelming. As I approached the turn, I didn't turn the steering wheel. Instead, I reached out and slammed my hand onto the hazard lights and the horn, held it down, and suddenly swerved the car violently back and forth. The unexpected motion threw him against the passenger door, his head cracking against the window with a loud thud. "What are you doing?" he screamed, lunging toward me with the knife. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I saw a semi-truck approaching from the opposite direction, its massive headlights illuminating the road like high noon. I didn't care about the rules of the road anymore. I crossed the yellow line, heading straight toward the massive truck, the air horn of the semi-truck blaring a deafening, terrifying warning. The man in the dress panicked. He saw the wall of chrome and steel coming toward us and did exactly what I hoped he would do. He dropped the knife and reached for the dashboard, bracing himself for an impact. At the very last second, I swerved back into my lane, the wind from the passing semi-truck rocking my car like a toy. The passenger was disoriented, his head bleeding from the impact with the glass. I didn't wait. I slammed on the brakes with everything I had. The car screeched to a halt, the smell of burning rubber filling the air. Because he wasn't wearing a seatbelt, he was thrown forward, his face hitting the dashboard with a sickening crunch. I reached over, unbuckled his door, and pushed him with every ounce of strength I had left in my body. He tumbled out onto the asphalt, dazed and clutching his broken nose. I didn't look back to see if he was getting up. I floored the gas, the tires spinning as I sped away into the night. I drove for 20 miles without stopping, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, terrified that I would see those heavy work boots running after me. I found a highway patrol station in the next county and told them everything. They found the wig and the knife on the floor of my car, but they never found the man. He had vanished back into the desert, back into the shadows where he waits for the next person with a kind heart to pull over. I never stop for hitchhikers now. Not for anyone. Because on the loneliest road in the world, you never really know who is hiding behind the hair.